Hello, church. We are so fortunate to be joined today by Bobby Cooper. Bobby, thank you so much for giving up your time to come and speak to us this morning. I personally find you remarkable, and I've loved the brief conversations we've had at St. Stephen's Church. Bobby, would you tell us something of who you are and what you do in a professional capacity?
Right, well, it's lovely to be here, and yes, I'm a member of the St. Stephen's congregation and have been a member for sort of over 20 years. And yes, I'm married to Edward and I have 3 grown-up sons. And in terms of what I do, I'm a consultant child and adolescent and adult psychotherapist in both the NHS and privately. And I'm also part of the recruitment and training of trainee child and adolescent psychotherapists.
Gosh. Now, Bobby, looking back over the past few months, there's obviously been all sorts of challenges. How has the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown impacted upon people's mental health in general, but also in how you respond to that professionally specifically?
Right, that's an interesting and big question. I mean, certainly the last 4 months have been a huge time in child and adolescent mental health services. It's been huge, really. And I think, when I think back to the beginning of this pandemic and slightly before that, I think there was a sense that it was something that was happening somewhere else, and there was a sort of element of denial about how it was going to translate over here. So it has taken people by surprise and a degree of shock. And certainly what we've witnessed is certainly an increase in referrals. They've gone through several, I didn't know we had so many roofs at camps, but they've gone through that. Lots of presentations of young people and families with anxiety-related issues, traumas that have been re-triggered, depression, low mood, OCD type issues, eating disorders, everything is coming. But I think it's also important to say that when there's an unexpected happening, it's quite normal to feel anxious, to feel sad, to feel overwhelmed, to feel your sleeping's been affected. But it's a case of degree. If that continues for a long time and starts to intensify, then it might be more than just a normal response to an unexpected event. And of course, alongside the pandemic, I mean, our CAMS clinics have been open throughout. We've been offering a service throughout, mostly remotely, but also face-to-face, so with PPE. But what also occurred, of course, at the same time was the tragic killing of George Floyd in America and the Black Lives Matters. And that triggered a lot of mental health difficulties for the local population that we see, both in terms of people who currently have mental health difficulties, but we were also getting a lot of new referrals of people who've never experienced anything like that at all. And for example, I have a white 7-year-old male child that I treat, and he and his mother had rung. It was the Monday after the build-up to all of this, in floods of tears on the phone, asking for an urgent appointment. And what has happened, this child is a middle-class white child. His best friend is black, and he'd been having nightmares that his friend wasn't going to grow up, and that if he did grow up, that a policeman would step on his neck and kill him. So we met and we were all in tears. It was just so painful, but also struck me just how deep and how raw this can happen, and it can feel, and it certainly has affected the nature of the referrals we're getting at the clinic. So, and it was almost like with the pandemic, a veil was removed, and what we thought was there suddenly was something quite different in technicolor color, lots of inequalities, poverty, isolation. It was really not a pleasant thing to look at. But, we've seen it and you can't unsee it. So in terms of mental health provision, we have had to sort of remodel some of our services because we can't meet the need. So we're offering groups rather than individual treatments to some young people who we feel could benefit from groups. For example, we've got concerns at the moment about some young people feeling quite slightly phobic about going back to school in September. So we're running anxiety groups throughout the summer to sort of hopefully support with that. There are also families who've had members who've died from COVID and haven't been able to attend the funeral, so we're anticipating that there will be some delayed mental health responses to that. And also, colleagues who've lost family members. So it's a strange, unanticipated, unusual time, and we're learning every day, really.
Yes, I'm fascinated by your description of this veil being kind of torn away to reveal something, and perhaps at the heart of our society that was always there, but we haven't fully noted, or many of us haven't been aware of before. Could you say a little bit more about now we have seen this? What on earth does that mean, partly for how we handle things like mental health, but also for all of us? How do we engage better with these issues, with these realities?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it was just, I think we projected a sort of shape to our ideas of what the shape of the kind of issues in society were, and we saw something very different when that veil was removed. And although that it's quite shocking, what it does provide is an opportunity to really look at that and to explore ways of engaging with it and addressing with it. And it's almost the need for a bit of a pause to really reflect on how to do that and to not dive in too quickly, because we will end up going round in circles. So we felt as a CAMHS clinic that we've had to sit with the trauma of what we're seeing. And we have groups called reflective practice groups, so we've been trying to think in groups about what we're seeing, what this means, and how we can address this. And certainly what we're learning is no single organisation can address it on its own, that it needs to be a sort of partnership response with schools, with the church, with all different organisations in society, local community groups. No single organisation can address what we feel we're seeing alone.
There seems something deeply wise there that perhaps we individually and as the church need to learn from, the tendency to jump in and to respond, to try and think of something to say and do in the face of tragedy or injustice, but actually to have the wisdom to sit back and say, what's really going on here? What might a wise long-term response be? That seems uncomfortable but really significant.
It is uncomfortable, and sometimes it's right to dive in and speak too straight away. And sometimes it's wise to hold back, and it's a paradox that one carries, because I think when people are hurting really deeply, sometimes the diving in and sitting with them, like the little boy and his mother who contacted me, we were sobbing. I just was so shocked, and it would have been wrong for me to come up with my mental health head and said, right, let's think about this in a cognitive CBT level. How, where's the rationale? How can we deal with this in a different way? I felt at that time I just needed to sit with it. And there was so much pain in that room, my pain, their pain. And no straightforward answers, and part of the answer was sitting with the pain, I think.
And there's something perhaps some of us, certainly I, need to learn to hold on to sit with the pain before seeking to respond when that's the wise response. Thank you. That's a beautiful picture of you being in the room with that little boy and his mother. Bobby, you're you're a Christian. You've been at St Stephen's for a number of years. I won't ask how many years you've been there. Can I ask either how you became a Christian or why you're a Christian? What difference does it make in your work as you encounter this real suffering and all these mental health issues?
Yeah, so my parents were, my father's alive, my mother not younger, but they were very, very strong Christians. They came over in the 50s, and so intergenerationally that we've been Christians in a way, and it's something that automatically speaks to me. It feels very much part of my soul. I did have a period at university when I kind of moved away from it a bit, where I kind of felt I needed space to really think about what I was believing in. And also, as part of my training as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, you have to have your own analysis, which is 5 times a week for 10 years. Being analysed, and that was quite a journey, an existential journey in terms of faith. But what held out all the time was just how vibrant faith, it's always come through. Yes. Even when I thought, is this going to be the time when I'm suddenly going to become an atheist or whatever? But it's always, Jesus was always somehow walked along the road and sort of says, well, I've been waiting for you to catch up. The answers have been there all the time. And my faith grows the older I get and the more despair, because working at CAMS, you can work with some really sort of levels of despair. You kind of don't have the imagination to imagine could happen. So you're thrown into a Dante's hell in a way. And my faith certainly has got me through that. There's no way I could do that under my own steam or through an intellectual way of looking at things.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way of framing it. Now, Christians, I'm including myself here, often get ourselves in a bit of a muddle when it comes to issues around mental health and suffering and then healing and hope. And how do you hold all these things together? Can I ask you, how do you hold these things together? Your faith, the God of hope and healing, but also uncertainty, despair, mental health, suffering. There's a lot of tension that seems to be tied up in that.
And there is a lot of tension often in that, and particularly at this pandemic, and it's almost like they kind of box each other, all those different things, trying to find a place in the same jigsaw puzzle, trying to integrate, and sometimes different things get moved around in different ways. But I think always at the top is faith and God for me. Through all of that, and the other sort of things fall into line. And I've noticed through this pandemic that colleagues of mine have become much more curious about faith and the meaning of life. They were initially bringing in copies of Camus' The Plague and trying to find some answers in that. And quite a number of them are sort of doing church online, having never stepped into a church at all. And these are, colleagues of all faith, trying to find sort of meaning about this. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the church to really join that, really. And I think the church has been great at joining that. And things like Love Thy Neighbour have been amazing, and I think have really brought God and the meaning of God in a very present way to a lot of people who were questioning. And they found a God who's with them at every level of their life, and not somebody who's remote and inaccessible, who's very much there. And I think Christians doing what they do in the way they do, in a positive way they do, in terms of responding to difficulties, there is God there, and there are those opportunities, I think, for those discussions to happen. And sometimes it's diving in and seeing what comes out. And I think people allow that. I think sometimes as Christians we feel more anxious about doing that.
So true. Yeah. Bobby, you mentioned a bit early on the impact of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. We've talked briefly about what role the church might have at the time of pandemic. Could I ask you, have you given any thought to what role the church, as internationally but also locally, can have to speak into that situation and that injustice?
Yes, that's a lovely question. I think it's very much speaking to it. I think the church, it would be difficult for the church to be silenced because it's such a huge tragedy and it dominoes everywhere. So I think we need to be part of the discussions, and what the church brings is compassion, the capacity to hear and listen. I mean, at work we have a reflective practice group, and we had to call one in emergency after the George Floyd killing. We're a multicultural group, and there was a lot of distress in the building. And in the reflective practice groups, people sit in silence and will speak to how they're feeling. And it's a safe space for people to say exactly what they're feeling and what they think, even if it can be quite provocative and challenging to hear. And I think it's sort of being able to be part of those debates. But I think the church can't afford to be silent at this time. And certainly a lot of young people are speaking to me at the moment. And one of them, an 18-year-old white middle-class girl, had gone on the march, on one of the marches, and her parents had been quite anxious because it was locked down. But she had gone along because she said to me, if I didn't go along, I would feel that these things were being done in my name because I'm part of mainstream society. So I felt I wanted to march with my multicultural group of friends to say, I'm your sister and I'm with you. And I think there's something about that not being afraid to speak to something that really is unsettling and shocking and does have an impact, because this young child that I'm treating, it had severely affected his mental health.
Thank you. Bobby, there seems that often when something like the Black Lives Movement happened, it brings out a natural defensiveness in people because we all tell our own narratives and we all have our own assumption. And as you were saying earlier about the veil being torn back, for lots of us we were quite comfortable with the veil there because it fitted a sense that we weren't complicit or we weren't involved in something which was fundamentally unjust. How would you suggest that we listen and break down our own walls, whether we recognise them or not, when we encounter something like this?
Yes, and that's a difficult question, and I think for each individual it will be different responses. But I think showing curiosity is certainly, and being able to challenge where one might be in that sort of journey, but challenge with compassion, because I think if people challenge themselves in a way that just kicks into guilt and self-flagellation in a way, it means that defensively you withdraw even more. And having those discussions with people and being, and speaking to what feels to be forming in you, because in our reflective practice groups, we're very clear that we don't want people to feel shut down and that there's a politically correct way of thinking about things. It's something about coming from where you're at, and then all together with all the heads in the room, we come up with a jigsaw puzzle together. But I think it's the courage to feel and sense that something might need thinking about and finding your own way. Because I think if there's a sort of prescriptive way and it doesn't fit a particular individual, they will then feel that they can't be part of that debate, whereas they may have the most important thing to say. So I'm always keen for people to speak to where they're at. And compassion is huge there, having compassion. And then that we're all learning in this journey. Black people, we're all learning, because what's been interesting about Black Lives Matters for Black people is we're learning huge new strands of history that we were not aware of. So it's also opened the door to more awareness about history.
Bobby, you've been so engaging and joyous, and it's been so wonderful speaking to you. You've been smiling through this, but you've had such a challenging few months that I can't even begin to comprehend what it's been like trying to do things in full PPE, trying to do things in new ways, the stories that you're hearing. What is it that has kept you going and will keep you going? You've talked briefly about faith, but what sustains you through all that you've been going through?
Yes, it has been a challenging times, and yeah, I'm smiling now, but in the clinic, it's a different sort of story. I mean, certainly having a solid staff team, we watch each other's back, and if somebody's flaking, there's a cup of coffee suddenly offered. So those sorts of kindnesses. It's a team where we've worked together for a long time. Family are amazing, really, really supportive, and I have an amazing group of friends, and including my book club buddies, and we've been a book club for 23 years, meeting monthly for 23 years, and what's really funny was when we met the first time, we thought we'd last 6 months, and 23 years later, all those books later, and we're all very different, but we challenge each other in a good way. And, most of all was my faith, going to church, my church family. They've held me up. And then the practical things, like you have to look after your health, otherwise you burn out in CAMS. So it's things like the usual drinking lots of water, because it can, your sleep, making sure you're getting as much sleep as you can, which has been a challenge over the last few months. How you eat, and for me, I start the day with prayer, with meditation, and on the days I don't do that, I really suffer. And last Thursday, I think, was the beginning of the really hot spell, and the clinic was like a greenhouse because we can't have fans on or the air conditioner because of recycled air. So you're in this sweltering building, and it had been quite a distressing day. Lots of young people in A&E. It was just one of those where you're just in a particular zone where you're on. And I got home and did one of those journeys where you've driven safely, but you can't remember the bits in between, and you arrive at your front door. And opened the door, the dog looked at me and kept out of the way. And I went up and sat down and thought, I'm just too tired to pray. I'm just exhausted. And the Bible fell open at Psalm 103. And I wasn't in a mood for praising. I was just deadbeat. And this psalm, praise my soul, and it ends, praise. And I suddenly got this energy from nowhere, and I came down, and our dog was sort of, is this the same owner that came through the door? And it changed my evening, because I was anticipating that I was just going to be down in the dumps, and I was ready to do another day. So it's certainly my faith, and every morning I pray that prayer of protection with the armor of protection, and if I forget to do that, I suffer. So it's a very clear and strong message to me that I don't do this under my own steam. It's God who protects me and allows me to go through those valleys. Without him, I just would not be anywhere.
Moments of his grace that permeate and break through in spite of everything. Bobby, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been lovely to have this conversation, and thank you. Church, we're going to round off the service in a moment, but I hope that's been helpful, and blessings for whatever you're doing in the coming week.